Royal College of Physicians has a wonderful collection of manuscripts that reflects the interest of physicians from the 16th century onwards, and especially from the 18th century onwards, who worked here in London, who were fellows of the college, and who collected Arabic, Persian, and also one Ottoman Turkish manuscript. And it mirrors the richness of Arabic medicine, of Islamic medicine in the Middle Ages. It lends itself very nicely to illustrating, on the one hand, the richness of the Arabo-Islamic medical tradition, and on the other hand, the interest and the richness of the engagement with that tradition in the early modern period, and also in the 20th century. The single most important person, arguably, in classical medicine is Galen of Pergamum. He lived roughly from 129 to 216 AD. Now, people, when they think Greek medicine, they often think of Hippocrates as the most important physician. And Hippocrates and the Hippocratic corpus is important, but it is not as important as Galen. Galen develops this idea of humoral pathology. It is the idea that there are four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that when they're in balance, this means that you are healthy, and an imbalance results in disease. Galen takes this idea from Hippocrates, but he makes it canonical. He makes it the dominant medical theory. He persuades his generation, or the coming generations, that this is really the medical theory that everybody should follow, and he's incredibly successful. And so this theory, the humoral pathology, is dominant until the 18th, 17th century in Europe. It's still with us a little bit even in the 19th and 20th century.
When scholars in the West became aware that the Arabs had so much to contribute to Latin, Western medicine, they looked for Galen first of all. And the greatest of the translators, Gerard of Cremona, who was working in Toledo, he was born in 1114 and died in 1187. He was probably educated as a doctor himself. He looked for these works and he concentrated on translating these works of Galen. By this time, of course, the Arabs had already contributed, had written many works on medicine based on the Galenic system of their own. And so the Latin translators also had these commentaries on Galen, or these bringing up to date of Galenic medicine.
So if we look at another figure, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Al-Razi, who dies in 925, we have somebody who is arguably the greatest clinician of the medieval period, but people will not necessarily have heard of him. Al-Razi, though, is important, and this was even realized in the West. So he wrote an encyclopedia, a medical encyclopedia similar to Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, and that medical encyclopedia is called Book for Al-Mansur, Al-Kitab Al-Mansuri. But he wrote also many interesting, like let's say monographs or books on one topic. He wrote a short book in which he distinguishes between smallpox and measles, a distinction that had not been made in Greek sources. And this book was very influential and very popular in the 18th century and in the 19th century. But he also wrote, for instance, doubts about Galen. So he would question whether Galen was right and would say, no, my own experience in the hospitals, at home, in my surgery, I saw this, that, and the other. So he had a very critical spirit. He was very innovative in other ways. He is less known than Avicenna and Galen, but he deserves to be much better known. And for me, he's really my hero in the story of clinical medicine in the medieval Arabic world.
When you look at the importance of Razis in the Western tradition, there's an interesting picture, because the first stage campaign for translation was that of Constantine the African, who was based in Monte Cassino towards the end of the 10th century. And he translated a very large compendium of medicine by Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi. But he disguised the name of the original, and in the earliest manuscripts it is attributed to Razi. So Razi obviously had a sufficient reputation to have this major work attributed to him in the Latin tradition. But it's in the second stage, that of the translations of Gerard of Cremona, that the genuine works of Razi become known. And then there's a third stage in the 13th century when Razi's most compendious work, the Hawi, which literally means the book which contains everything, this became translated into Latin in a complete form towards the end of the 13th century.
So Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, is undoubtedly the most famous physician from the medieval Islamic period. He is also the towering figure in medieval Arabo-Islamic philosophy. He became incredibly famous. Avicenna was born in 980 and he dies in 1037. And so he didn't have a very long life, but he had a very intense life. And he hailed from the Persian-speaking East, but wrote most of his works in Arabic. So his philosophical ideas become absolutely dominant in the medieval Islamic world. I mean, there are people who criticize him, of course. You know, generally speaking, one can say philosophy after Avicenna is very different. And so he wrote this one book, the Canon of Medicine. I mean, it's one work in 5 books in which he deals with the generalities of medicine, then discusses the diseases occurring in different places in books 3 and 4. And then in book 2 and 5, he deals with medicinal substances. And so this medical encyclopedia, so to speak, became incredibly popular, both in the East and in the West, as it was translated into Latin, because it was so user-friendly. He divides and subdivides and sub-subdivides and sub-sub-sub-sub-subdivides his topic. It has this very clear structure. You can easily remember, it's very mnemonic. So that makes it a good book for students. And indeed, students did read it and learned medicine, both in Arabic and then in the Latin universities of Europe from this book.
And there was a drive to transmit all of Arabic learning, scientific learning, to the Latins through translations. And the major figure was Gerard of Cremona, who probably was educated as a doctor, but he said that he arrived in Toledo specifically to look for the greatest work in astronomy, that is Ptolemy's Almagest. But at the same time, he was translating texts on philosophy. In fact, the majority of his works, the largest number in any of these categories, are works on medicine. And he was translating not only the Greek texts, which had been translated already into Arabic, but also central Arabic classics, as it were, from the East, like the works of Avicenna and Al-Razi, but also local works which had been written by doctors within Spain.
So when we think of science and medicine as a science, obviously we want to discount or discard things that seem to us to be irrational. You know, no magic, no horoscopes, no astrology. But for instance, astrology, but also magic, were part and parcel of that medieval culture, both in the East and in the West. So if you want to really understand what was going on in, let's say, the 10th century, you cannot dismiss magic or you cannot exclude astrology. So take Al-Razi, the greatest clinician, an incredibly inquisitive mind. He's also somebody who tries to convert, let's say, silver into gold or copper into silver. He's an alchemist who writes a lot on alchemy. He also writes on magic, and especially the medicinal uses of magic in his Kitab al-Khawas, the book of hidden or occult properties. He explains that we shouldn't dismiss occult properties just because we haven't witnessed them. Experience and evidence is very important when discussing it. So for him, he uses the same techniques of experience and evidence, of tests, when he talks about magic. And this shows us that magic kind of was part of the world for him. Take the moon. You know, there's no doubt that the moon influences what happens on Earth. You just have to look at the tides. It's the old problem of action over a distance, which is still discussed in physics today. So our modern scientific principles are, of course, great, but we shouldn't apply them when we look at the past. And so it's important to remember this when we talk about magic. Galen's human pathology was dominant and stayed dominant well into the Renaissance, but there were challenges. There were people who questioned his ideas about how health worked, and one notable challenger was Paracelsus. Now, Paracelsus hails from a German-speaking background. He lives roughly from 1493 till 1541. He challenges human pathology. He doesn't have the four humors. He has three elements, or prima as he calls them, prime substances, which are sulfur, salt, and mercury. And they can be used both in order to make somebody healthy, but they also, when imbalanced kind of within the body, lead to disease. And distilling and these chemical processes that were already known from the alchemical tradition of the Middle Ages become very important for this Paracelsus. So a lot of people dismissed him as, like a charlatan and, mountebank. But he had his followers. And two followers were somebody called Kroll and somebody called Sennert. They were both German professors of medicine in the early 17th century. And these two professors wrote their own books on chemical medicine.
So we have the system of the skeleton, we have the arteries, the veins, the nerves, and the formation of the fetus. These are whole page illustrations which one imagines could have been self-sufficient, just as kind of mnemonic guides for the doctor. The other context, however, in which we find an anatomical, one could say an anatomical image, is at that juncture between medicine and magic, or medicine and astrology, where you have the different parts of the body assigned to different signs of the zodiac, from Aries being on the head, through the 12 signs of the zodiac until you arrive at Pisces, or representing the 2 feet. And this is a very commonly occurring illustration, used specifically for medical reasons, because it tells you which part of the body not to cut when you're bloodletting. And you are told that you must not cut the part of the body which belongs to the sign of the zodiac in which the moon happens to be, because the moon is influential of all the fluids, as we can see in its influence over the tides. If you did happen to cut a part of the body in which the moon was in the sign of that part of the body, there would be too much blood coming out. So there was a rational reason for this. The question of how long astrology and magic were regarded as being part and parcel of the medical tradition is a difficult question, because even in the most sophisticated medical texts in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you will find some magical recipes.
So if we look at the collection and to the Arabic or Oriental holdings in this collection, there's one big problem, and that's the Great Fire of London, which happened in 1666, and in which the Royal College was more or less burned down completely. So a lot of things were lost. So from the earlier days, from the days of Keys and Lineker, we don't have that many items, or none at all actually. But then people started collecting again and were very eager to fill the gap that this great fire left. There are some classics like Avicenna's, Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, and of this canon we have a fairly old manuscript, a manuscript dated by its colophon, by a little text at the end which says this manuscript was written in the year 1214. So it's a very old manuscript of the canon. We have authors like Al-Razi, who's a great clinician and who is represented in the manuscripts through a few short items, but in the Latin he becomes very important. And for instance, there's a printed edition, one of the first printed edition of his Arabic treatise on smallpox and measles, translated into Latin by John Channing. So in the 20th century as well, books come into the collection. The most important collector is somebody called Roy Dobbin. He hailed from Ireland. He studied at Trinity College, Dublin, but he spent most of his career in Cairo, He worked at the Qasr al-Aini hospital and was responsible for gynecology and obstetrics. And he developed an interest in the history of obstetrics and gynecology. There's one object which I really, really like, and it's a printed book, not a manuscript. And it illustrates like no other object in this exhibition, like both the exchange of ideas between East and West, but also the continuing interest in medicine, in the early modern period. And this is what the Royal College of Physicians, of course, is all about. It is John Channing's edition of the Arabic text and translation into Latin of Al-Razi's book on smallpox and measles. Now, Channing is an apothecary, son of an apothecary and father to an apothecary, and he has a very rich and thriving practice in London, but he finds the time to learn all these languages, Arabic, Greek, and so on and so forth, things that were not normally required of somebody who's an apothecary in London in the 18th century. And so it is also this amateur learning, this amateur aspect of curiosity, which is so important for many of these royal societies, at least at the beginning. And so this object has all these different aspects. It has innovation, it has like the continuing tradition between Greek and Arabic, but also criticism. So if you come as a visitor to this exhibition, you will see different things. On the one hand, you will discover how the Greek tradition in particular was very important for the Arabo-Islamic medical tradition as it developed. The other thing you will take away from this visit of yours is that you'll see that this Arabo-Islamic tradition is very innovative. We have a wonderful case here on Al-Razi, who's a great clinician, and we have different instances of how he was innovative. You will see that there is no East and West, never the twain shall meet, as Kipling put it. No, we have one medical history, one shared legacy across the shores of the Mediterranean, and that is really an important point in this mirror of health, this mirror that reflects ourselves and shows us that like those whom we regard as the other are actually very much like ourselves and partake in that same tradition.